here and for bringing everyone here as well. It has been a marvelous 2 days of talks. I've met a lot of experts in the field. Some of them are my 偶像 or idol, you know. I've been reading their work for a very long time. So it gave me the opportunity to actually see them in the flesh, and of course, meet new people as well. Okay, so what I'm going to do today is I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the work that we do at the Science of Learning in Education Center at NIE. We are housed, or we are an institute within the Nanyang Technological University. We are an autonomous institution, but our parent organization is NTU. And maybe just a few brief facts about the National Institute of Education. We are the only teacher training institution within Singapore. So all our teachers come through us to receive training before they go out to schools. So this means that we have access to thousands of teachers on the ground, and we have direct implications for teaching policies and, of course, learning pedagogical practices as well. So a big part of what we do is to try and understand teaching, not only just the academic side of teaching, but the social aspect, and of course, some of the other aspects such as executive functioning, development, and whatnot, using research and some of the methods that we use. Ooh. Yep. Okay. Okay. So as I mentioned, I am from the Science of Learning and Education Center, or at least part of my appointment comes from this center. So what do we actually do? Our role within the National Institute of Education is to really understand how students learn in a formal or informal environment. And this is something that is well funded within the Singapore Ministry of Education. Now, I will say that a lot of what we do now is sort of a consequence of what happened during COVID, right? So as we all know, during COVID, there are shutdowns to schools, there are shutdowns to how we can access information, or at least in Singapore, we, as with other countries as well, there are a lot of preschools, schools, high schools, and universities that had to stop teaching, and we had to sort of pivot very quickly to other means of delivering our lessons. So I would consider this sort of an unexpected consequence of COVID, in a sense that a lot of what we do now as researchers within the Science of Learning and Education Center is really on how do we adapt to this new model of learning, because as the years, or as we see in the last couple of years, universities, higher education, in primary schools or secondary schools as well, they're sort of moving to this model whereby we should be able to sort of how do you say, maybe shoulder a little bit of the effects of the next pandemic. So if there is a next pandemic to come, we will be able to sort of move to an online sort of application for us to continue on teaching and learning. So this is something that the ministry is very interested in looking at, is to look at how we sort of learn within a digital space, particularly in our younger children, in preschools, in primary schools, and even in high schools. So this is a large part of research that we do within the Science of Learning and Education Center. And I'm going to present some data, some of which are unpublished data that we are still trying to collect. So they are very preliminary in stage. Some of them are already published. And if you want to have some of those papers, just you can send it to me. If you are interested in what we do, you can scan the QR code over there as well. I will have a QR code at the end of my slide. So just in case, if you think that you want to collaborate, do let me know. Part of my role is also in partnerships and collaborations as well. Okay, so we all know that learning, all right, occurs formally. It could be in schools. It could be in an informal setting at home, in the environment, outside, right? And when we talk about education, or at least education in Singapore, we kind of follow this framework quite closely, or Bronfenbrenner's model of ecological systems theory, whereby we believe that the child, or the learner in this case, is affected by different systems within the environment, right? So we have your microsystem, which consists of things like your family members, friends, peers, your immediate neighbors that you interact with, and you learn and you develop with them together socially. We also have your exosystem, right, which is your environment itself. So where you live, your potentially the school that you're at, the services that you are able to receive, right? And of course, there's also your macro systems, which are things like your attitudes or your perceptions or your ideologies towards things. And of course, there's also the chronosystem, whereby these are events in the world that might affect the way that you think and might affect the way you perceive, right? So we all learn and we all take reference to these systems, and all these systems affect us in many different ways, right? Whether it's an immediate relationship between you and your parent, or you and your friend, or you and your peer, or it could be global events, right? COVID is a classical example, right? Because of COVID, we had to pivot almost immediately. The first year was pretty much in shambles because everybody had to learn how to use Zoom. Everybody had to learn how to mute yourself, right? Or unmute yourself in many cases, and even now as well, right? So we all have to learn all these new habits that come along with big global events, which I guess is the reason why we're here. So in many cases, what we do, or what we find ourselves, is that all these different environments, or all these systems within our environment, shape the way that we think, and it affects the way that we behave as well, right? So one of the I mean, of course, Bronfenbrenner comes from a more sociology, psychology perspective, but we also know that all these environmental factors do have a direct effect on our brain function and even our brain structure as well. So, and this is something that we have known for a very long time. I would like to sort of bring you to this paper over here. All right, so this is a paper that I've read years ago when I first started my PhD, 14 years ago. And back then I was trying to find evidence for how lifestyle behaviors, or how your environment shape the way that you think, and how the environments shape the physical development of the brain itself. And I sort of came across this paper. This is probably one of the first few papers that sort of demonstrates how the brain can be shaped through experiences. And what we do find is that across all these years, right, there are certain attributes or certain behaviors that would have a more significant impact on how we learn and how we perceive things within our surroundings. So things like social interaction, which we have all just heard, exploration as well, providing or trying to seek out novel experiences, multisensory experiences as well. So being able to incorporate different sensory information is a lot better for your learning and development. Embodied learning or embodied cognition, this is a big topic within education, the use of movement and the use of, I would say movement to learn things. Exercise, as everybody know, is key. And of course, communication as well. So we know that all these 6 different factors affect the way that we acquire skills or we learn whether to a large extent. Now, I'm also sort of, I don't claim to be a psychologist, a psychiatrist, or a social science person. I come from an exercise and sports science background, right? So all I wanted to do when I was young was just to play sport and go to the gym, right? I didn't really care so much about how I felt, how I thought. But I think as I dabbled in research, I sort of understood that I need to sort of understand how the way I think to understand how the way that I act, right? So forgive me if I were to say, if I were to not quote a framework that that psychology people or sociology people would use. This is part of me being naive to the field a little bit, but I sort of come more from the physiology, the neurophysiology aspect, or the more neuroscience aspect of learning. Okay, so now to understand all those different contexts that I've mentioned earlier on, and as you have heard through all the speakers and all the oral sessions as well, we use neuroimaging a lot to try and understand the brain, right? So typically when we say neuroimaging, we generally gravitate to things like MRI, EEG, maybe some sort of brain stimulation protocol, right? And all these different modalities, right, or traditional modalities, they're advantageous because there's already a lot of information that we know, right, based on MRI, EEG. They've been around for many, many years. You know, they can be considered gold standards in many different scenarios. And there's really a large database of information, right? I mean, MRI research, there are repositories whereby there are scans that you can download data from. So we already have a lot of information when we look at some of these techniques. But some of the disadvantages here would be things that, you know, MRI generally quite costly to administer. I don't know about Hong Kong or other parts of the world, but generally in Singapore, if you were to do one scan, that's around $700 an hour. Which is, you know, if you're going to do a pre-post measure, that's 1,400 per participant. And if you need sample size, then, you know, that's astronomical, right? A lot of the results, as you will hear from, you have heard from a lot of our keynote speakers, that the results are mostly correlational and not really causational, right? And I guess for me as a person that's interested in movement, my thought is that how do we translate information in the scanner when you are lying down to something that's a bit more dynamic, let's say in sport, or maybe even in the classroom? How do we understand what is going on in highly dynamic environments, right? So when I first started my PhD, when I wanted to look at gait in Parkinson's disease, a lot of times, or at least in the earlier work, when you want to try to understand the neurocorrelates of gait, you put somebody in a scanner and you get that person to imagine themselves walking. That's one. You have a motor imagery protocol, or potentially you might get them to maybe move their ankles a little bit, right? Again, yes, but I think some of the results that they got were somewhat relevant, but is it actual gait? I argue it's probably not, right? So again, my thought process was that if I can find a way to understand the neurodynamics in a highly complex environment, I could probably start to understand some of these bigger social issues that is associated with learning, right? So I very shamelessly take photos of my students during experiments, and I shamelessly put them up. So I do apologize to my students if you do see your face here. But by and large, I mean, I do some EEG work, I do some MRI work, but my lab, or at least my team, we do specialize in the more portable systems over here. So a speaker earlier on showcased functional near-infrared spectroscopy. So for those of you who do not know what that technique is, I would say it's almost like a hybrid between MRI and EEG, where you would get hemodynamic responses from FNIRS, but nowadays you do have a lot more portable systems that are associated with this technique, right? So it lends itself very well to a classroom environment or in a sport environment. If you look at EEG, the application of EEG does take a while, can be a little bit messy. It's very hard to get participants, especially if you're trying to get kids in schools. it's a bit of a mess. But with NIRS, generally, if you are trained well enough, you can sort of go in and apply it quite quickly, right? So again, a lot of the data that I'm going to show relates to NIRS. And I mean, of course, there are EEG equivalent data as well and MRI equivalent data as well. Okay, so to me, at least, when COVID happened, all right, so initially I had the title of this was Key Challenges in the 21st Century, but as I was sort of sitting there, these challenges are also sort of instigated because of COVID as well, right? So there are a few challenges that I personally feel, and I guess in terms of the education research field, this is something that we are also very interested in trying to tackle some of these challenges. One of them is, of course, ICT use, right? Use of AI and social media within not only within school context, but also within social contexts. There's also the aspect of social communications and relationships. I think this is something that is already very prevalent theme over the last couple of days, right? And of course, lifestyle behaviors. So, you know, are you physically active? Are you exercising? Or are you more sedentary? You know, so all these things are things that we are very interested in because we feel that these are some of the key challenges that a lot of our adolescents now in Singapore, I mean, I can't say for everywhere else, probably the same issues as well, that adolescents in Singapore would face, right? So what sort of research do we do? I'm going to sort of systematically go through these three categories. Again, if you have any questions, if you want to ask those questions, then just do stop me and then we can answer. But if not, then I'll just keep continuing. So in terms of children and ICT and media use, right? We know that during COVID and post-COVID, and this is again information that has been repeated over and over again, is that during COVID and even now post-COVID, we see an increase in ICT usage worldwide, right? So this is something that we can't prevent. It is definitely a good thing, but it can also be a bad thing, right? So it depends on how you look at it and how you manage it. We, of course, see an increase in work from home policies everywhere around the world. I think nowadays companies tend to be a bit more flexible in terms of what you do. Some may be more flexible than others, but it's changing the way that we behave from years and years of, you know, doing the same thing over and over again, going to work from Monday to Friday, or sometimes Saturday, or sometimes Sunday as well. Right? So it's sort of changing the way that we behave from a societal point of view. There's, of course, increase in digital services as well, right? So I'm sure in Hong Kong, in Singapore, it's the same, that even now doing groceries, you don't even have to step out of your house. And in some countries, groceries get to you within half an hour. It's more cost effective for you to go onto your app, choose what you want, and you have things sent to you, right? Even buying clothes, you don't even have to go to the department store. And the best part is some companies even would give you refunds if you don't like what the color is, right? So again, there are all these services that have come into play that we are now changing our behaviors to suit that environment, right? And of course, there's also an increased use of social media as sources of information, right? So in the past, or at least before COVID, I mean, of course, there was Twitter, there was, you know, Facebook, and probably MySpace, which is very, very old. There's of course TikTok and all that. And these have become forms or sources of information that we get, that we can go. And I mean, some information that they provide is great. Some information that they provide might be a bit more dubious. But generally, I think nowadays, if I were to ask my nephew, about something, he would probably say that he got that information from TikTok or got that information from Facebook, right? So it has become so pervasive within our lives that we are very reliant on the tech that we have and the software and apps that we live by. So how does this then affect, or how does this behavior then sort of translate into our population? All right. So this is a study that was done by a colleague of mine within my department, which is to look at the digital media use in Singaporean children. All right. And these are preschool children. So these are children that are not even in primary school yet. Okay. And what we see over here is that you would see that across the board, right? So this is time spent per week, or the mean and median. Let me see. Hopefully I don't press the wrong button. But the age from 2 to 4, from 5 to 7, and this is sort of just an average. This is from 2 to 7, right? So if you were to look at these two categories over here, you would find that on average, a child that is 2 to 4 would spend roughly 3 to 4 hours a week on some sort of digital device, right? So again, this sort of tells us that a child that's age 2 already has a digital device in Singapore, right? And there is also data as part of this paper as well, that out of the 4,500 families that they've screened, 96% of them have got a digital device for their child. 96%. All right, so that is a very high number. Okay, so what this sort of tells us is that every child in Singapore, almost every child in Singapore, have access to either a smartphone, an iPad, a laptop that they would use, right? Whether it's for formal education or for entertainment, but it is accessible to that child. So this paper as well sort of dives in and talks about that children who are born in the last 5 years are pretty much, or at least in Singapore's context, are digital natives. So they are born with an ICT tool, right? And they somehow develop habits that are also related to the use of ICT, even before they are able to speak, and even before they are able to say read anything, right? So if you, again, if I were to use my own experiences, I mean, I don't have any children, but when I look at my nieces and nephews, and they are all sort of within those age range as well, you can find that if you don't put on a particular show or YouTube video, you know, they do display very different behaviors, right? So again, it sort of tells us that from a behavioral perspective, that these tools around you, depending on how you would use them, your child will sort of mimic that sort of relationship as well, right? And of course, through this survey that Lee did, we also saw increased digital media use time, increases sedentic behaviors, and of course, reduces moderate to vigorous physical activity over here. Okay, so in terms of what happens when we embark on, or when we use a lot of digital media, this is a systematic review that one of my collaborators and we're sort of embarking on this. I'm not sort of showing you the results just because we're still preparing the manuscript, but these are just some of the studies that have been potentially included within the systematic review, which I thought was actually quite interesting. And we actually do see that studies have sort of reported, and these are quite large studies as well, that there are structural and functional differences when it comes to digital media use time. And children, adolescents in this sense, I do apologize, it's not preschool, but adolescents. So from preschool age to all the way up to, I believe it's 14 or 15, there is this association with altered structural changes, right? So higher media use time was correlated with lower cortical thickness, lower sulci depth. The other finding was that, of course, higher screen time, more than 1 hour per day, was significantly associated with things like cognition, language, social emotional skills as well. So again, I think there is all these associations over here that sort of tells us that, yeah, maybe there is some level of influence on brain structure and, of course, your behaviors as well. This was a study that was published using the Gusto data, so the other presenter in the earlier session. Again, this was, so the EEG data that they've used at 18 months, this was again a predictor of poor executive function with higher infant screen time as well. So again, there are all these neurobiological markers that we can see that are highly associated with the use of screen time and media. What exactly then is really going on, right? So how, I mean, like, as I mentioned earlier on, a lot of the neuroimaging studies are correlational, not really causational in nature. I think that this is probably sort of a new area of research that right now we are sort of venturing into. Of course, I don't know whether ethically we can have an active group whereby we give them more screen time and a control group or not. But I think over time, over the next few years or next 5 or 10 years, we can start looking at some of this data when we look at this from a life course developmental perspective. So what really happens when we engage with media? So this was a small pilot study that I did with some colleagues of mine. This study is not published or anything. This was just really some pilot data that we've collected to sort of establish some differences in media use. So we recruited 12 participants in a crossover design. And what we did was that we presented them with 2 conditions, one text reading and one watching a video, right? The text and the videos were similar in a sense that the video was, it was a video of what the text said, right? So essentially, the participant will have to read the text, and they will have to then conceptualize what that text means, whereas the video literally showed them what that is. And what we see over here is that if you were to look at the scale over here, okay, great. Maybe I don't use this. I'll just. Okay, so if you look at the scale on your right, spatial awareness is not very well today. 0 being your baseline, and anything above 0 would be a change, an increasing change, and anything below 0 is a decreasing change, right? So what we actually see across almost every participant is that during text reading, right, and this is NIRS data, by the way, this is not MRI data, right, is that we see that during text reading, we see a large increase in prefrontal cortex activation, right, particularly in the medial prefrontal cortex, right? Whereas if we watched a video, we don't really see much activity going on. Maybe there is some level of activation going on the left prefrontal cortex, but generally, if you compare the difference, you would see that text reading elicits a higher response compared to watching a video. And we were actually puzzled initially because we thought, well, yeah, we present them with videos. You know, the videos are exciting. It should sort of stimulate all these processes that's happening. So why don't we actually see that? So when I did a little bit of thinking and sort of recap, right? I realized that as I was looking through the literature, that when I read something, it required a lot of focus and attention, right? So when you read something, you literally have to focus on what the word said, right? Also, because texts doesn't really provide you with a context. When I say, imagine a pink elephant, you don't imagine the word pink elephant. You imagine the animal pink elephant, right? So if you were reading a text, you would have to translate the words into something that is contextual, right? So then again, this requires a lot more cognitive effort for you to do so, because you are now having to change word from a word form into a pictorial form. Reading as well helps to develop phonological and character association as well. So depending on what you read, whether it's in English, whether it's reading Mandarin characters, you have to either pronounce the word as it is phonologically, that's a bit of a mouthful, or you have to remember what that word sounds like when you're reading a Chinese text, right? So again, there are all these processes that you have to go through just by reading a text, right? And it requires cognitive effort to actually do so, which sort of explains why text reading, you get this increase in brain activity. But if you're watching a video, all the information is already presented in that video. If the text reads, the sky is blue, and you watch the video and you see a blue sky, you don't have to think about it, right? So again, video provides you with the context. It provides you with all the information that you need that you can capture in a very quick period of time. And if you look at if you actually look at a video itself, especially if you have a social media profile or if you have Instagram and Insta Story, you would see that a lot of videos now are very short in duration, right? So most videos are a maximum of 30 seconds or a minute maybe. It means that if you are constantly looking at these videos, your attention span is probably only about that 30 seconds to a minute, right? Whereas if you were to read a text, you could be reading until you maybe get to the end of the chapter, you might go, okay, I might close the book. But by and large, you can still continue on, right? But in many cases, if you look at a video, most videos ends at 30 seconds. It gives you a very quick snapshot of what the person is doing in the video or the video is. And it provides you with a lot of information, right? So all this information, it could be information that is very distracting. It could be information that is very good. But by and large, the whole concept of a video is to help you reduce cognitive effort, right? So again, I think this quote over here, picture, I can't remember who told me this, but somebody, I didn't make this myself. Somebody told me this. A picture says 1,000 words, a video conveys 1,000 messages, right? So again, to me, at least if you were to compare text reading itself versus looking at a video, of course, looking at a video is more effortless, whereas reading requires a bit more effort. And if you were to imagine, if you're always looking at a video and not reading text, what sort of implications does that have from a developmental perspective, right? So again, this is probably something that is a bit more downstream, maybe requires a bit of a longitudinal type of design, but by and large, I would almost imagine that if you don't usually read that often, it is very difficult for you to read text, or at least your attention span will be a lot shorter. Your ability to process all that information will be a lot less as well. Okay, so how do we then mitigate some of these effects of screen time? Again, I am a strong supporter of ICT use. It is unavoidable, right? We can't, I mean, I guess we can live without computers, but moving backwards, it's going to make our life a bit more difficult, right? I mean, the question here is, how do we scaffold or how do we optimize the use of ICT so that it helps a teacher, a parent develop, or helps the child develop those skills, those cognitive skills that the child should be acquiring? And there are a couple of things, or there are a few things, a few strategies that we are sort of looking at. I think one thing that we observe through some of the projects that we run is that parent support and guidance is essential, especially at a very young age. So whenever there is an opportunity to co-use ICT, so meaning to say that if you're watching a documentary, if you're watching something, do it together and have learning opportunities during that co-use, right? So this is obviously one. Not all media is bad media, right? There are obviously media that is good media as well, and it's taught me a lot of things, right? I mean, I've learned a lot of things from David Attenborough. I mean, he's got a wonderful voice. Michael Mosley, unfortunately, he passed away, but you know, I've learned a lot of things from his videos or his media. So there is a lot of good media out there. So again, it's about managing the use of media and managing how your child uses that form of ICT. The type and form of media is, of course, important, right? So whether it's text-based media, whether it's audio-based media, or whether it's videos. Again, I think if you're able to scaffold these adequately for learning, I think it's a very powerful tool. The question, the problem now we face is that there is a lot of uncontrolled time that a child uses media for, and there's a lot of uncontrolled types of media that a child is being shown, right? Especially with AI, especially with I guess some of the features in Facebook or all the platforms. It's very hard to control all that, right? So again, I think there are strategies that we can use to mitigate the effects or the negative effects of ICT use, but it does require a little bit of guidelines. Okay, so apart from the role of ICT, I think the other aspect that we are very interested in understanding is how students or how adolescents collaborate or work together socially with one another, right? So as you've heard from Professor Lam previously, he talks about sociality. We look at sociality from a more individual point of view, right? And we have, I mean, this is not a biomarker that we have developed, but we have developed the expertise within our center to look at how different people can collaborate with one another and how the neural signatures of two individuals collaborating with one another sync with one another as well. All right, so these are a couple of papers that we have published, some with my collaborators in Beijing, and some of this data is collected in our own laboratories as well. Is that we are looking at this concept of interbrain synchrony as a form of social collaboration. Okay, so in most of our experiments, what we do is we get the students to come in, whether they are high school students, whether they are university students. We get them to come in. Some of them may know each other, some of them may not know each other. We hook them up with FNES devices on, and we get them to solve a task, or we get them to interact with one another. And through that interaction, we are able to measure, one, the physical collaborative performance, that's one. And two, we are able to also measure how synchronized the brain regions are with each other, right? So there are certain regions of interest that we are looking at specifically. One's, of course, the prefrontal cortex. The other one is the temporoparietal junction, the left and right temporoparietal junction. These are all nodes within the default mode network, which, you know, obviously are implicated with social interaction and you know, your mirror neuron systems. So I don't have a heap of data to show because we are still in the process of collecting. We do have some preliminary findings, all right? And some of these preliminary findings include that if we see increased collaboration, especially if the collaboration is of high quality, we see this increase in interbrain synchrony within the prefrontal cortex and also the right temporal parietal junction as well. That where it is synchronized is dependent on the task that they have to do. If it's a more logical task, so if they have to solve a math problem, if they have to look at some spatial awareness type of task, we see more synchrony between the prefrontal cortex. Whereas if it's a more socially interactive task, right, then we see a lot more synchrony between the temporal parietal junctions. So that's one that we see. The quality of interaction is underpinned by this increase in synchrony between those brain regions. The other finding that we sort of have is that if we pair two people that are of different metacognitive abilities, meaning if one partner has a high metacognitive ability and the other one slightly lower, they seem to demonstrate a higher level of synchrony between two individuals that have got the same level of metacognition. So this is the other finding that we have, is that potentially if we get somebody who is better in their metacognition, they tend to, or at least they tend to be able to synchronize better with someone with a lower level of metacognition. And lastly, what we've also done was that we did a project whereby we looked at screen time and the child's interactions with the parents. And what we do find, again, this is very preliminary, is that the associations tend to be a lot lower when the child has higher screen time with, or at least the synchrony between the mother and the child is a lot lower with increased screen time. So that we see this negative relationship sort of occurring. Okay, so the next part over here is a study that was not intended to be of anything to do with COVID. It just so happened that I got this grant in 2019 and 2020, COVID happened. So we got some data during COVID, right? So again, I will confess that this is not meant to be a COVID-related study. It just so happened that COVID happened, and therefore we have COVID-related data, okay? So when I first came back to Singapore in 2018, I got this grant to look at physical activity, digital media use, and its impact on brain activity, cognition, and physical well-being in children 4 to 5. And back then, the reason why we came up with this study was because of this report card over here. So being Singaporean, we have to grade everything, right? We have to bracket everything as A, B, C, D, E, and F, right? So this was actually a study that was published by the National University of Singapore School of Public Health, which basically is a health activity kids report card, essentially. I mean, they didn't test kids, but they had data that sort of suggested a few things, right? So if you were to look at this middle column over here, they pretty much banded the category. So this is essentially like your grading system. If you were to mark your students' assignments or your test assignments, this is what you grade your students with. And they looked at a few factors. So they looked at a few things. They looked at things like overall physical activity of children aged 4 to 5, organized sport and physical activity, active play, active transport, sedentary behaviors, physical fitness, family and peers, schools, community environment, and government policies. So they've rated those few aspects or those few things according to A, B, C, D, E, F, E, and F, right? So what we have found is that, so there are a couple of things which I will sort of bring to your attention, right? So overall physical activity is rated as C-, which is not that great. In Singapore, we hate to fail, right? As all Asians, we hate to fail, right? So getting a C is not good, right? Must be an A. Okay, so overall physical activity, C-, organized sport and physical activity is a B-, active play, active transport, sedentary behaviors, they're all C-, right? So this sort of shows, and this data is, okay, so this top half of the data is taken from Gusto as well. So again, we have this longitudinal study called Gusto, and you can apply to get data from it. Every year or every few years, they collect data points, and physical activity is one of those data points that they are collecting. Now, the interesting thing is that over here, if you look at the bottom over here, these two, Community and environment is an A+, and government policies is a B, which is not too bad, right? So in Singapore, our public infrastructure is that if you live in public housing or in any sort of neighborhood, there needs to be a park, there needs to be a sports complex, a swimming pool that is attached to that neighborhood. So every child is only about a 10-minute or maximum 15-minute bus ride by public transport away from a sport facility, right? So we have the infrastructure, we have the policies in place to allow you to be physically active, but yet we are not very physically active, right? So this sort of points towards maybe a slightly different problem, right? So this is sort of what got me thinking a little bit about why we have given you as much as we can, or at least from a government's perspective, the government has given as much as possible, but still there are factors that are sort of barriers towards physical activity. And this is, of course, compounded when COVID happened as well. This data that you're seeing here is pre-COVID, because this was published 2020. This was actually quite new, but this was definitely pre-COVID data. Okay, so back to that study again. So there were 4 research questions that I wanted to find out. And this was part of an international trial that wanted to look at 24-hour movement behaviors in young children, so children 4 to 5, right? So we are looking at, so the first question is how much habitual, moderate to vigorous physical activity and sedentary behavior is associated with digital media use, right? That's one. Do levels of moderate to vigorous physical activity differ between countries? And back then, all these other countries were also part of this collaboration. We wanted to also see a greater habitual MVPA, or moderate to vigorous physical activity, associated with cognitive outcomes, physical outcomes, and brain activation. And of course, lastly, digital media use, right? But then, of course, COVID happened. So therefore, we can't really do our international comparisons. But I still managed to do some other things. Okay, so as part of this study, essentially, these are the general or main outcome measures that I'm going to report. The study is a little bit bigger than this, that I won't go into detail about the other outcome measures. But generally, what we have is an ages and stages questionnaire, which looks at fine and gross motor skills. The earliest toolbox as well, which consists of a battery of tests. And we have elected to use the go, no-go task and an NBAC task, or working memory task. Again, we employed functional near-infrared spectroscopy. The digital media use was assessed using a small Q questionnaire. So this was a parent-reported questionnaire that they have to fill out. And we also had hip-borne accelerometers. So we had 7 days whereby the child will have to wear an accelerometer on the hip. And it had to have at least, or it had to have 5 weekdays and 2 weekend days, at least, right? So these are the findings in total, because it was, we had a bit of a lockdown, but fortunately, I think in Singapore, our lockdown measures weren't that bad, in a sense that a lot of people could still go out. I mean, of course, not in big groups. Schools were generally still open. Generally, I say. Some schools remained shut, but some schools were generally open. Preschools were open, again, just to facilitate childcare as well. So we were able to go into one of those preschools and collect data. And in total, we had data for 80 preschoolers. There was probably a dropout rate of, I would say, 10%, which was not bad during COVID. But yeah, so these are just some of the data that I'm going to present. So when we look at moderate to vigorous physical activity, all right, in school or during school day. So this was across the whole school day, from the time that they woke up to the time that they slept. The average school day, moderate to vigorous physical activity was 22.8 minutes, right? And on the weekend day, it was 24, just slightly higher, but then again, it wasn't that significant. 24.2 minutes. Okay, so on a school day, 22 minutes, weekend day, 24 minutes. Sedentary behavior was around, in school day, was around 427 minutes, which was 7 hours. So they were sedentary for 7 hours. And on the weekend day was around 556 minutes, which was around 9.2 hours, right? Again, bearing in mind that this was during the COVID period as well. Digital media use time in school, it's 43 minutes, and weekend, it was 52 minutes. Okay. So this was sort of the habitual physical activity profile of our Singaporean population back then. To sort of answer the second question, how do physical activity levels differ? I mean, we can't do countries because a lot of countries did not collect data. So what we did, or what I did, was that I pulled out a study, and this was by random chance, by the way, as well. Again, this was a study conducted by the NUS, National University of Singapore School of Public Health, and this was published in 2020. So this data would represent pre-COVID times, right? So I had a bit of comparison. So I have my own data. I made sure that the protocol was roughly the same, I would say. So this used hip-1 accelerometry as well. They sort of reported the data based on all these different categories, which we did. And what we see here is that if you look at the sedentary column over there, this was 7.7 hours, right? So this is in hours. So 7.7 hours, which if you were to look back, sedentary was 7.1, about the same. But on the weekend day, we find that during COVID, or at least my data, was showing 9.2 hours, whereas on non-school days, this was 8.2. So it was an hour more during the COVID lockdown. If we look at moderate to vigorous activity over here, so this is 0.5 hours on school days and 0.6 hours on non-school days. So this is roughly around half an hour, 40 minutes on school days and non-school days. We only had 22 minutes on school days and 24 minutes on non-school days. So it sort of showed that during COVID itself, there was moderate to vigorous physical activity dropped by half in Singapore in this population of people, in population of children. Okay, so when we looked at some of these associations over here, these are just various multiple linear regressions that we did. We didn't do anything too fancy. Again, we don't really have big data to play around with. So we just wanted to see if there were any associations that we could find at all. By and large, if we were to look at things like impulse control, working memory, so this column over here represents impulse control. This column over here represents working memory. The y-axis over here represents sedentary time and time spent in MVPA. For your impulse control index, the smaller the number, the better the control. The larger the number, the worse your performance, right? So smaller number, better performance, larger number, poorer performance. And what we find is that, I think in general, what we do see is that we do see a relationship for, or an association between time spent during moderate to vigorous physical activity, MVPA, with better impulse control, right? Again, the smaller the value, the better the performance, equates to higher MVPA. We don't really see any associations with any of the rest of the measures. If we look at gross motor function, right? So this time around, the bigger the value, the better the performance, right? We do see a significant association between MVPA and gross motor function, but not necessarily fine motor skills, right? Next, when we looked at brain activation, we didn't really see any associations over here. If we look at the go-no-go tasks, this was probably approaching significance, but then again, I'm a little bit skeptical with this data over here. And last one, which is essentially digital media use and impulse control, right? So my fault, I should have plotted impulse control here so that it's the same as the one before, right? So lower values indicate better performance, higher values indicate poorer performance. We see lower digital media use associating with better impulse control here as well. So again, I think some of the data that we got here basically suggests that the more or at least children who do moderate to vigorous physical activity tended to have better impulse control, right? That's one. Better gross motor function, which sort of makes sense, I guess. I mean, if you are more engaged with moderate or vigorous physical activity, gross motor functions tend to be a little bit better than fine motor skills. And again, if we look at the go-no-go task or brain activation during the go-no-go task and the working memory task, we don't see any associations whatsoever with digital media use time. Okay, so take-home message. So I think what I'm sort of suggesting over here is basically what every other keynote speaker has sort of highlighted, and perhaps even in more detail than what I've done, is that socialization is important, right? It's we all need to communicate. We all need to be social. Exercise is also just as important, right? So again, I think if I can remember what Professor Christoph says, that if we were to redo all this over again, what would we change? Perhaps maybe not make some of these restrictive lockdown rules so stringent that we can't go out and exercise, right? So I think socialization, exercise, definitely important. I think, at least for me, we do need we do need better guidelines in terms of things like ICT use and awareness of social media and physical activity within homes and even in schools, right? So even when we interview school teachers or when we interview parents, you'll be quite surprised as to how much knowledge do they know about ICT use and exercise. The role of the parent and teacher is critical. I think this is something that we try to instill in our students because our students become teachers in schools, right? So all these so apart from just knowing how to teach math or knowing how to teach language, it's all this peripheral, I won't even say peripheral, this is actually important fundamental skills that they need to know and they need to learn as part of their teacher training program. And lastly, I think this is something that we've discussed, I've discussed with Natasha. Is there a need for this reevaluation of what our cognition is? When, in Singapore, we use the term a new normal. I mean, I don't like the term the new normal, but, do we have to reevaluate some of what we used to know in today's context? I mean, if you consider that changes in technology, changes in the way we use media is moving exponentially, is our brain fast enough to adapt to that change? And what sort of consequence does it have when we try to keep up with changes over time, right? So thank you very much for listening to my talk. Again, my acknowledgements are here. I do have to acknowledge my funders. Basically, it's the Ministry of Education, but they have different strands. And my collaborators that I've been collaborating very well with, and of course, my students that are here to support me. So thank you very much, everyone. I hope you have a very good conference and a very good time from here. Thank you.